Hello, konnichiwa. Thank you for being here. Thank you for Toda for hosting. It's always good to come back to Tokyo every year to see my friends and colleagues here. I have been working to support local people working for peace in Palestine and Israel for several decades. And unfortunately, this is just another round of horrific violence, tragedy on both sides for Israelis, for Palestinians. And our hope is that somehow out of this crisis, there might be a window to a new path forward. So I wrote just 2 weeks after October 7th, when the war in Gaza had was just beginning. But of course, it's just an escalation of what's been happening for many years. I wrote a policy brief for the Toda Peace Institute on what a peace plan might look like. So I will just touch on a number of the points that are in that policy brief. And at that point, I was hearing people say either there is no other way but waging war on Hamas in Gaza, or just call ceasefire. But both of these simple phrases actually, are not enough to explain the complexity underneath the situation. For Israelis, a ceasefire meant a continued threat from Hamas, and did not answer that question of what to do with Hamas leadership and popular support. And, to say that there was no other way, but the current path was also inadequate because it's wrought so much human, civilian cost of life. What for many years, for those of you who've heard me talk before, I've been working to find a solution in Afghanistan, was very active trying to find a peace process for Afghanistan, for Iraq, and trying to convince the US that there was no military solution in either Iraq or Afghanistan. And eventually even our military leaders started also saying there is no military solution. It's only a political solution in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now really the lessons that the US learned over 20 years in the global war on terror, we see again, people making the mistake thinking that there's a military solution when these are fundamentally political problems. And so I think the echo of what we heard earlier from Hugh, of being stuck thinking that somehow Israel might kill all of Hamas, or somehow Hamas might inflict enough damage on Israel to change something. It's such naive thinking, this reliance on military force by both sides. So we continue saying, as people who believe in peace, that there has to be another way, because this solution, I call it the fantasy of firepower, it works with Hollywood, but it doesn't work in real life. And increasingly, it is military scholars who are studying the futility of war. In the United States, we have a military think tank called the RAND Corporation. And they have done a study on how terror groups like Hamas end, but also how wars end. And decades of US research show that most terror groups end through law enforcement and a political peace process, not through military force. So, we have here the US military's top strategists saying, there is no hope for Israel to destroy all of Hamas in this way. Somehow we have to get beyond this sort of reliance on military force. So what these military strategists are increasingly saying is it really is a war of ideas, and we need to think about how do you dismantle the ideas. And you dismantle ideas through a political process where people can work together to find solutions. Increasingly, the metaphor of every bomb being like a seed planting a harvest of hate That was a phrase often used in the global war on terror. And we saw the fruit of decades of US bombing of Afghanistan really result in a harvest of hate, with more and more Taliban every year. Just the total futility of dropping bombs on a country thinking that you were going to get rid of the Taliban, and it actually ends up strengthening it. Unfortunately, we've seen the same thing happen now in Israel and Palestine, where Hamas was not very popular before October 7th. In fact, most of the people in Gaza did not support it, wanted to keep a ceasefire with Israel. But now that the fighting has begun, now that the bombs have been dropping incessantly on Gaza, we see more and more Palestinians being supportive of Hamas. So the ideas that Hamas has been preaching are growing stronger, not weaker. The recruits are more in number, not fewer in number. Somehow we need to get to a strategy to ensure the safety of Israelis and Palestinians by depriving Hamas of a narrative that terrorist violence is the only way that Palestinians will gain their freedom. And so this is why so many, even now in the Western political world, are starting to say, we have to have a political solution. Palestinians have to have freedom and dignity and rights. We saw J Street, which is a Jewish American movement. It's always been pro-peace and pro-Israel. It came out several weeks ago saying, we just need to announce that there's the formation of a Palestinian state. So already we see actually things are breaking loose. The worldview of the status quo, which has been, it's been stuck for Palestinians for many years without progress towards their own state or their own sense of dignity and rights. We see that the war is creating a sense that the status quo is no longer going to work. Part of this, of course, requires dismantling the Israeli occupation. For Israelis, this is difficult because it means, to many Israelis, that would mean accepting more insecurity. And partly Israel would defend its occupation by saying every time they loosen it, there are more suicide bombers, there's more attacks on Israelis. And so Israel has taken this cycle of just, they call it mowing the lawn, keeping the level of conflict manageable. But what the latest round since October 7th has shown us is that the status quo is not acceptable to Israel as Israelis either. So we need a political solution ensuring that Palestinians have equal rights, democracy, freedom of movement, as well as reparations for their lost land and homes. We need to find and punish Israeli leaders who authorize, motivate, and carry out attacks on Palestinian civilians, just as we need to find and punish the Hamas leaders that carried out the attack on October 7th. For those of us who live in the United States, like myself, what we are trying to do is to tie US aid to Israel to dismantling the occupation and to political solutions. So really there's mechanisms already in our policy that tries to tie foreign aid to human rights standards. Somehow we need to move to a paradigm where we start thinking about how do we have a political solution that really is protecting all civilians in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel, all the Palestinians, all the Jews living in this region. And there's been this phrase, from the river to the sea, that actually both sides have used, imagining that for some Palestinians, they would imagine all of that land being Palestine, and for some Israelis, all of that land would be Israel. The reality is these two peoples have lived now side by side for over 70 years, and the future has to include both peoples living in this land and figuring out how to share it. We need interdisciplinary challenges, approaches to change. This is what I really love about the Toda Peace Institute, is that we take a very interdisciplinary approach, thinking about psychology, economics, politics, all the social sociology and social cohesion approaches. And of course, in the Holy Land, it's also very deeply spiritual because Jerusalem is the capital for Muslims, for Christians, and for Jews. This land has spiritual significance, and we need to find a way of sharing it. For those of us on the outside, we need to continue to refuse the binary of supporting one side or the other and hold together the peoples that live in this region. So instead of just sort of amplifying an us versus them or flying the flag of one side or the other, how do we sort of hold together the future of the people and think about building bridges in this region? Soon after October 7th, I drew this image and I shared it on Facebook actually and said, this is how I see the region. Both Palestinians and Israelis have their extremist wings, and those extremist wings have been very influential, using violence against each other and convincing most Israelis and most Palestinians that that they should side with the extremists rather than to see the moderates who want to coexist with each other. And really, I wish we had more political leaders who could draw images like this and say, okay, how do we isolate Hamas and the far-right Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, which now even most American leaders want to distance themselves from and say, we have to invest in this middle who are committed to coexistence with each other. This is a photo from when I was living in Israel and Palestine in 2017. It was a very beautiful peace march with thousands of Israelis and thousands of Palestinians. Actually, these were women peacemakers. These were Israeli and Palestinian women who were leading the way into finding a solution. The leader of this movement, called Women Waging Peace, her name was Vivian Silver, and she was unfortunately killed on October 7th by Hamas. Many of the kibbutz, the collective farms that Hamas raided, were actually very progressive peace movement people. So some of the leaders of the Israeli peace movement actually were killed on October 7th, including the woman who organized this march. It was a march to the Dead Sea together. So there's these thousands of Israelis and Palestinians, and there was a big tent of Sarah and Hagar at the end, where in biblical literature, the women of both of these traditions would sit together and find a way to peace. One of the things that's often overlooked in Israel-Palestine is the trauma that both sides have experienced. There's a relatively new book called The Holocaust and the Nakba. For those of you who've not heard of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, it means catastrophe in Arabic, is what happened in 1948 when many Palestinians lost their homes and their farms and their businesses with the formation of the State of Israel. Many people have criticized holding these two very traumatic events together, but increasingly people realize that all of the people in the land between the river and the sea are deeply traumatized, that within the last 100 years, the Holocaust happened and the Nakba happened. And we can't have political solutions that don't take into account the trauma, the intergenerational trauma of all the people here. And finally, I think we need to think about laying the groundwork for the next generation. The great worry is that the current crisis could plant further seeds of hatred and dehumanization. And somehow we have to find a way of holding the people together. And that is where we're starting to use technology, a new set of deliberative technology to enable Palestinians and Israelis to make decisions and talk with each other at scale, thousands of people talking online with each other and finding what do they agree on, where's their common ground, what are the principles for a political solution that everyone can agree on. And my hope is that by next year when I visit Tokyo, I can report to you on what this digital dialogue deliberation looked like and what has happened. And hopefully we will have a peace agreement by the end of the year. I'll end with this quote. It's actually from the Old Testament, when the prophets told us that everyone neath their vine and fig tree shall live in peace and unafraid. Sometimes these prophets from thousands of years ago have great wisdom for the present. Because indeed, when people do not have their vine or fig tree, when they do not have a home, when they don't have a way of living, no one can live in peace and unafraid. The sort of interdependence of the people who live in this region is what I think it speaks clearly to us. Thank you very much.
I think I have a question to Lisa Schirch. I think you mentioned protection of civilians, and I very much agree that international humanitarian law for the protection of civilians should be strictly enforced. But the fact is that that is the kind of international law that is very least enforced in history. So I wonder how we can enforce international civilian humanitarian law to protect civilians, as we see the situation in Gaza and also Ukraine.
Thank you for the question. I think we need to put the protection of civilians first, always. And the humanitarian principles of proportion and they've been interpreted more on the behalf of military strategy. So Israel defends its bombing of hospitals, saying Hamas is there. They probably are. But I think if we had a stronger international system, military forces couldn't be using this excuse. And the primacy of protection of civilians would always have to be first. You can't wage a military struggle if there's going to be mass casualties of human civilians. So, at precisely the time when the international system is sort of weak and it's not, we see the need for these things even more. So I think at the Toda Peace Institute, many of us are working on trying to understand how to reinforce the need for these international norms and laws, and putting, more attention to that principle of protection of civilians. Thank you.
My question is very simple. I would like all of you. What's your definition of peace? Because is that something that kind of like a utopian world, or is it or anything else? And then I would like to know how you think we should put as a goal when we say peace building. Thank you so much.
Yes. When I teach my courses in strategic peace building, this is the first lecture on the first day. What is peace? It's a society designed for everyone. So it's really an idea of pluralism. Every human being is different, distinct. When you're designing a society, you're making sure that there's education, transportation, healthcare, governance, that is meeting the needs of all different parts of that society, the plural, the age, by age, by gender, by ethnic group, religious group. So peace is a concept that is found more in some societies than others, because some societies really are designed around caring for every member of that society. And Japan does very well in terms of designing for peace. Other societies are not designed this way. And so it's a human choice. It's not that violence is equally distributed around the world. We design societies for peace. And when we do so, we have more peace.
I just want to ask, no. Can you clarify, both of you, can you clarify something for me? First, about protecting civilians, and you said the international system is not effective, or
it's declining in effectiveness.
But you were talking about in the context of Gaza. So, but to me, I mean, it's not the international system that can stop this. It's the United States. There's no other country. It's not a system. It's the U.S. So if you can clarify what you're saying with that.
Yeah, I think the U.S. has a very large role and certainly supplying the military weapons. But Europe, especially, has been very supportive of Netanyahu over the years as well. So Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel. And, you know, I think ever since World War II, the UK, well, since the early 1900s, the UK, the United Kingdom, has played an important role in Israel-Palestine, dividing it first and justifying an Arab state and a Jewish state, trying to play the mediator and not doing a very good job of being a mediator. So I think there's blame all around. You can also look at Egypt and Syria and Jordan. There's the regional countries also have not been supportive of Palestinians, to be quite honest. They could have done far more to support a Palestinian state, a democratic Palestine instead of Hamas. And so, unfortunately, Palestinians who've been wanting their own democratic state have been up against a lot because everyone's been against them. Israel's been against having a democratic Palestinian state. Egypt has, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iran. And so there's really a situation of shared blame right now. And while the US may be out in front receiving that, the international community needs to decide together that they would like to have a democracy in both Palestine and in Israel, or in some kind of one-state solution. That's for the people of the region to decide, so I don't want to put my own view on it, but there's a range of creative options on the table. And the people within Israel and Palestine who want democracy need the support, not just of the US, but of Europe and of the other Arab states in the region.